bring that, and they will sort of synthesize those questions so that we can go to those after the presentation. So what I'm going to talk through is a bit about some of the backgrounds and challenges, some of the background or challenges vis-a-vis the government, the host government, the challenges that we face in terms of our response, and the challenges that the urban refugees face. I'll talk a little bit through, as you see on your screen, some of the methodology we use to do this research, and then what our findings were vis-a-vis assets, vulnerability, coping strategies, resilience, and some of the conclusions then that we come up with along the lines that you see there. So in terms of background, and I know many of you know this, but I think it's important to contextualize this information, especially as we think about the challenges in doing urban refugee livelihoods. As we all know, or as most of us know, 80% of refugees are hosted by developing nations, so that already has implications for how we think about economic programming. 42% are in countries where the per capita income is under $3,000 per year. So that already indicates the sort of economic challenges these countries are facing, even without the impact of the refugees being there. But we also know that refugees come to urban areas often as kind of a self-selected process. The better educated come, those with more skills, they know there are opportunities there that they want to access that perhaps are not available in camps if camps are in those countries. In terms of some of the challenges from the host government side, the host country side, as we all know, there are 142 signatories to the UN Refugee Convention, but that many of these countries actually have reservations to various articles, and some of those articles are the very ones that have impact on what we try to do in vis-a-vis the right to work. In fact, only 37% of 214 nations, this was research that UNHCR undertook, have enacted or enforced the necessary legislation and issue work permits. So only 37% actually give that full range of rights for refugees to fully engage in the formal economy. Host governments, as we know, they fear competition. They have a large amount of unemployment with their own populations. They worry that giving refugees the right to work leads to sort of de facto local integration. They seldom view refugees as potential assets who can contribute, and instead see them as problems, as contributing to rising crime rates, overburdening services, competing for scarce jobs and resources. But they seldom look at the potential that refugees might bring in terms of filling skilled and unskilled labor shortages. And those labor shortages exist in every country that refugees are, whether that's shortages of doctors, nurses, et cetera, regardless of the income rates and the unemployment rates in those countries. In terms of some of the challenges we all face as people trying to respond, we're so used to doing camp-based programs that that's kind of our fall to response of how do we go in and set up services. And that obviously is no longer applicable in these settings. And despite that, however, host government legislation and NGO service provision hasn't actually adjusted in step with what those emerging needs are and how to respond to those in a very different way. And those being that the growth in numbers, for example, far outstrips a parallel growth in funding. So the number of refugees in urban areas is growing much, much more quickly than the donor response to those numbers are. In fact, in the 2001 UNHCR statistical yearbook, only 13% of registered refugees lived in urban areas. Now, obviously, that's probably not an accurate reflection because those were only the registered refugees, and there was a very different approach to urban refugees at that time. Now, as we all know, that's more than 50% and is growing rapidly. In Kampala, for example, one of our field assessment sites, the refugee population tripled between 2007 and 2010. The length of displacement, of course, is also growing. And this means that providing subsistence allowance, direct food aid, providing direct services is no longer going to be viable. It's just economically not going to be viable. So this requires a new kind of thinking, a kind of thinking that means not doing the camp-based approach, not setting up new programming, but actually looking for different approaches. Some of the challenges the refugees face in these areas are those you see listed on your screen. They live in areas plagued by poverty, unemployment, crime, limited infrastructure. They often don't have the right to work and so are relegated to the informal economy and all of the risk that come associated with that, which you see on the other side of the screen, the exploitation, the harassment, the abuse. They're scattered over wide geographic areas, which makes service provision difficult and makes even identification and outreach difficult to these populations. And they receive often minimal assistance. There's challenges with access, there's challenges with mobility, transportation can be very expensive for them, which again has implications for how we think about refugee livelihoods and how we do our work. So what did we do? The Women's Refugee Commission undertook 6 different field assessments on the sites you see on your screen: Cairo, Nairobi, Kampala, New Delhi, Johannesburg, and Panama City. What we tried to do is look at, try to get some geographic diversity, some refugee population diversity, market diversity, and host government policy and diversity in host government policy and practice. So we wanted to look at very different economies, to look at those constraints, look at those opportunities, and look at how the various refugee groups were doing in these contexts, with the aim of developing global guidance for practitioners on the types of livelihood interventions and approaches to implement them in urban areas. The methodology we used was to assess the economic coping strategies, the protection, risk, and market opportunities faced in each of these contexts. So what were those activities they were undertaking to meet their basic survival needs: food, water, shelter, potentially health and education, recognizing that these coping strategies can be positive, i.e. safe and legal, or negative, dangerous, risky, and detrimental to their longer-term health. We also looked at the 3 to 4 different refugee nationalities in each setting so that we could get an understanding of how different groups fared, which groups were doing better and why they were doing better, for example. We targeted different wealth groups, so we looked at the very poor, the struggling, and the better off, and we had the refugee community actually give us defined criteria for what those look like in each of those contexts. Because again, we wanted to figure out if some are better off, what's different about them and about what they're doing than those who are not. We wanted to figure out who's making it and why, and then we looked at their assets and their access to resources. We did focus group interviews disaggregated by age and sex so that we could understand what those different needs were, of the differences between women, men, female youth, and male youth. We did in-depth household interviews because, again, we wanted to see what assets they actually physically had in their possession and to assess their living conditions to see if that matched with the information we were getting from the focus group discussions. We did semi-structured interviews with refugee-run businesses and with employers of refugees. With the employers, we wanted to figure out why are they hiring refugees versus host country nationals? What could we learn about that? And with refugee-run businesses, we wanted to figure out how they were doing. What was their gross income versus their net income? And we did key stakeholder interviews, including development actors, and visited project sites and markets. So through those 6 field assessments, we consulted over 1,000 refugees, 100 service providers and government officials. We also consulted host community members because recognizing that many host community members face the same struggles, so to figure out what we could learn from them vis-a-vis opportunities and economic coping strategies. And we interviewed dozens of development organizations in those settings to try to at least learn a bit about the kind of work they were doing with the urban poor to see what might be applicable or not for the refugee populations. So let's move on to findings. In terms of findings, I want to talk first about assets, because assets are the building blocks of a sustainable livelihood. By building these assets, individuals and households develop their capacity to cope with the challenges they encounter and to meet their needs on a sustained basis. So we looked at their social capital, and that social capital not only enhances refugees' protection, whether they're living near each other or traveling together, but was the most vital source of information dissemination about NGO services, about employment opportunities, and about housing. In addition, when refugees were in great need and need to borrow money, for example, for emergencies, for financial shortfalls, more than from any other source, they borrowed from other refugees. So social capital in the work we undertook was really seen as the most important asset that a refugee in an urban area could have. This enhanced their protection, this enhanced their access to information, this enhanced their access to services, and yet we as the responders or the practitioners paid very little attention to how do we actually emphasize this and build this. We also looked at their human capital, i.e. what kind of education and skills and health, etc., do they bring to these contexts. And what we found is that often it's a mismatch, I should say, with the needs of an urban environment. For example, in New Delhi, you have a large population of Burmese Chin coming from a very rural, underdeveloped agrarian background, coming into one of the larger cities in the world, and hence the skill set they bring with them is not matched with the needs, the employment needs of that urban environment. We looked at the physical capital. That means the shelter, the roads, the infrastructure, etc. And what's interesting about physical capital, I think, is it's a pull factor and a limiting factor for urban refugees. Refugees come there for access to better services, access to more opportunities, and yet they end up often in peri-urban or slum areas that have very poor infrastructure, poor shelter, poor roads, limited public transportation, which limits their access to markets and opportunities, poor water sources, bad sewage, etc. So the very things that are kind of a draw for them often are not the things they actually have access to. And then we looked at their financial capital, i.e. what sort of programs, livelihood and financial asset building programs were they participating in. And I think for the most part what we found, we did find some very good practices, but we found for the most part these had very limited or poor outcomes on actually on their self-reliance and on sustainable self-reliance. In terms of vulnerability, we found that these varied significantly by nationality. Again, taking the New Delhi example, the Burmese Chin were far more vulnerable in that city than, for example, the Afghan Sheikh refugees, who not only came with resources, but actually had a lot of cultural similarities with the host community, which made living there and some sort of integration much more feasible. We found that the social safety net is often needed for the few. We're always going to need that social protection mechanism for those who are most marginalized or most vulnerable, but that often it was used for the many. So many people might be receiving subsistence allowance for 3 months or 6 months, for example, when in fact the needs may be quite different. And in fact, the model often used in urban areas incentivizes vulnerability. The more vulnerable you are, the more likely you are to get services, and the more services you're likely to receive. We found GBV risk associated with the livelihood strategies that people were employing. So in Kampala, for example, Congolese women go door to door through various neighborhoods selling Congolese cloth for making dresses, which expose them to risk of harassment, exploitation by police, lack of being paid by customers, and even being sexually abused by customers in their homes. And so the livelihood strategies available to them are often lead to very negative outcomes. We also found that those who are most highly educated are often excluded from the market, as the regulations, host government policy often limits access to the informal market. Those most highly educated are either unable or unwilling to participate in those kinds of activities and want access to the kinds of employment they had previously, which is unavailable to them, which often means then they don't participate. And because of the challenges in urban areas and the fact that it takes multiple income earners to actually meet the cost and expenses, children, as of 14, 15, and 16 are often doing day labor, and as a result are not in school. And what we heard over and over again from the parents is our children are actually ending up less educated than we are. In terms of our findings on the economic coping strategies, as I referenced, there were many negative economic coping strategies. These were common. In Kampala, for example, the LGBT refugees were primarily engaged in the commercial sex industry because that's the only viable economic option they saw for themselves. The host community members didn't want to buy things from them. Their own community members didn't want to buy things from them if they were engaged in market activities, and so they saw that as the only option. So these kinds of coping strategies were common. We also found that those service providers who were providing services had done very little in terms of gender analysis to figure out time usage between men and women, roles and responsibilities, who has access, who does not have access, and what does that mean in terms of those differing needs and how you cater to those needs. As I mentioned previously, the social networks were vital. People said that was more important. The refugees said that was more important than the resources they had and the skills that they came with. It was who they knew and how they plugged into those various social networks. As mentioned earlier, there were very limited opportunities were limited to the informal market and the risk and exploitation that comes with that. And because those jobs tend to pay very little, there was a need for every able-bodied adult and older youth to actually be earning income. There was a need for people to have multiple income streams just to meet their basic needs. In New Delhi, for example, the Burmese Chin that I interviewed, many of them were working in the irregular factories, and they were making about 2,500 rupees a month in those factories, a single earner. But a single room with a shared toilet down the hall cost 3,000 to 3,500 rupees a month. So you saw, as you started looking at income versus expenses, one income earner in the household was never going to make it work in those urban environments. We found that youth were falling through the cracks. There was very little attention to their needs for both continued learning and earning at the same time, and how do you marry those things and provide opportunities for both. And that, in fact, the economic coping strategies that refugees were employing impacted child protection outcomes. The first thing that the refugees would tell us is when they couldn't meet their expenses was they would pull their children out of school just to save on transportation costs, school uniforms, pencils, etc. And they would start limiting the amount of food in the household, often to one meal a day, sometimes only rice. And so, of course, that has consequences for the development of those children. In terms of resilience, what we found, of course, in spite of all of these challenges I've just raised, a remarkable level of resilience among the refugees. By and large, the refugees were coping and surviving in these often very, very difficult environments. often doing it at great risk to themselves and sometimes harm to their families. And that often meant, again, multiple income earners, including the children who are 14, 15, 16 years old. They're utilizing very diverse approaches and multiple income streams, often engaged in all sorts of informal activities, and the women might be doing laundry for somebody one day, watching somebody else's kids the next day. I mean, really mixing and matching how they bring income into that household. So what we need to think about is how do we, as long as those are positive economic coping strategies and not detrimental, how do we support what they're already doing and actually help them earn a more dignified wage for what they're already doing? Is there a way to build that up? And another thing we found is that those who were doing best had really tapped into the bridging capital, i.e., making connections with host community members. They often got loans from host community members. They became business partners with host community members. So those that had kind of figured that out, how to engage with that host community economically, besides just trying to sell to them, were doing the best. And I think as we think about economic programming, we need to think about how do we actually encourage and support those, that bridging capital between refugee and host community. So now let me move on for about the next 10 minutes to conclusions and sort of recommendations for us. So the first conclusion is around promoting an enabling environment, because obviously the government policies that are in place have direct implications for refugees' protection and their vulnerability. If they're limited to the informal market, we've already lost half of the argument here. So that advocacy with host governments is vital, and it has to go beyond just the right to work. But what does that mean in terms of regulations around work permits, around certification and recognition of diplomas, et cetera, that whole role. And if we can engage there, we can change and move up on the starting mark. And then we need to think about how do we build these various assets. Often, I think when we're doing programming, we think about giving people jobs, i.e. focusing on those financial assets. But in fact, I think some of our learning has been it's really a combination of these assets. It's the social, it's the human, it's the financial, it's a diverse package of assets that needs to be strengthened. So how do we, for the social assets, how do we capacitate and support refugee-run organizations to build up that social capital, including things like village savings and loans associations managed and run by the refugees themselves? How do we support and build human assets? The learning and the earning I mentioned for the youth, developing employment readiness skills, using existing vocational training programs, those that have been vetted so that we know they have good job placement outcomes, and then building those financial assets, linking refugees to business development services, to microfinance institutions. How do we create pathways for that so they can better build their financial assets? We need to really be thinking about diverse interventions to meet and address the different vulnerabilities and skill sets that the refugees bring with them. There's not a single program, no single program is going to address all of the economic needs of that population. So how do we think about segmentations of that population? And then how do we help households diversify their economic activities? Again, recognizing that they need to have multiple income streams to actually meet their expenses. So some of the steps that we promote in doing that are, again, focusing first on that policy environment. How do we make that as enabling as we possibly can for those refugees there? Getting a real sense of the skill sets that refugees bring with them, because we often start as if, they're people without a history here. What have they done before? What skills have they brought with them? I remember when I was doing some work in Addis Ababa and doing a focus group discussion with urban refugees there who were primarily from Mogadishu, And I went around the room and asked them all, well, what did you used to do? And, one said I was an engineer, a couple said they were teachers, one said he had been a doctor. Again, they were coming from a fairly well-educated urban environment. But the thing that struck me was at the end of this, they said, no one has ever asked us that before. No one has ever asked us what we used to do. And, we would actually like to use those skills to benefit our own community. So we need to understand the skill sets. And then how do we marry the skill sets with the market opportunities that are out there? UNHCR and CGAP, among others, promote what's called a graduated model or a graduation approach, which I think is extremely important in how we think about working with urban refugees. That for those who are very poor, we need to focus on the social protection. How do we help them meet their basic needs? And while doing that, how do we actually then start providing inputs, other services, other programs that actually eventually graduate them out of that model? We often do one or the other. We give people loans and say no more subsistence allowance and expect them to make it, or we just put them on indefinite subsistence allowance if they're very vulnerable without these other programming interventions. But in fact, they need to be married. We need to be thinking about where people fall on this graduation model in terms of their resources and their assets, and how do we ensure they're able to meet their basic needs while providing access to additional services to actually graduate them up to the poor, to the better off by the kinds of services that we provide. So we think the components of good practice are to promote this enabling environment, to profile the population. Let's understand who's out there, how many women are out there in the population, how many female youth versus male youth, because only then can we do effective programming. We need to assess their skills, and then we need to identify and map the services that are already in place in these urban environments. Some of those services are poor, some of those services are better. How do we target the ones that are better, the better vocational training programs, again, that have better outcomes, the better microfinance institutions, the business development institutions, the job placement services that may exist, and how do we vet those and facilitate access to those and focus our financial resources and our personnel resources on further capacitating those services. We also need to think about only creating services to fill gaps. Health services exist, education services exist in these contexts. Perhaps there aren't GBV programs, that kind of thing. So we need to think maybe there's not financial literacy programs. We need to think about only creating services that fill gaps that don't already exist in that community, and then ensure that those services also include host community members. We need to be thinking, I think, about when working in urban environments, what does this mean for the kind of partners we have? I think we need to be thinking about new kinds of partners. And I don't have answers on who those might be, but who are those actors, for example, that are doing work with the urban poor? Can they be our partners here? And I know UNHCR is already thinking this way in terms of working with Brock, among others, to do some of this stuff. We need to focus on building, again, this range of assets, the financial, the human, and the social, to really promote self-reliance. And we need all of these things to be market-based. What are those opportunities that are out there? They may be limited, but how do we exploit what is available there? We need to build on the current economic coping strategies that they are employing, if those are positive. And if they're relegated to the informal market, which is generally the case, we need to think about how do we engage with that. In many of these contexts, the majority of host country nationals are also engaged in the informal market. So how can we make that work in those markets as safe and as dignified as possible, and to pay as dignified of a wage, as livable of a wage as possible? some of the ways we might do this are taking much more of a case management approach with urban refugees, really knowing the individuals and what those individual needs are and focusing on referral and job placement. We might need to work much more closely with and through refugee organizations who know their own populations best. And I think use our donor dollars differently to actually focus on the economic development of those neighborhoods and communities that are most impacted by the refugees, so that our investments serve both the refugees and the vulnerable host community members. And I think only in this way do we make the policy environment of that host government potentially more amenable to the refugees being there, and make the work much more palatable, I think, to those host governments. So how do we think about making this a win-win for all parties involved? And I'm just going to conclude here with, I think one of the other things we often overlook is the opportunities that exist in urban areas. We often look at urban refugees as challenges and problems, and why are they here, and what do we do with them since they are here? But we need to recognize that part of the reason they're there is because there's this wealth of opportunities that exist in urban areas that exist nowhere else. There are vibrant markets, there's infrastructure, there's transportation, there's communication systems, there's better medical care, there's better educational facilities, there's access to technology, there's a much better educated population, there's a very diverse range of employment opportunities that don't exist in camps and rural areas, and there's a myriad of service providers. So how do we tap into that potential and build on that potential and facilitate access to that potential? And then just in conclusion, what I want to say is, refugees can, this has to be part of our message, refugees can and do significantly contribute to urban economies. They're renting apartments, they're shopping at markets, they're spending money, they're bringing in new skills, and that has to be part of our dialogue with local and host government. And what I would like to do is stop there, and for about the next 15 or 20 minutes is open it up for questions, which I would ask Annika and Mary Beth to kind of help moderate. But thank you all so much.
Thanks, Dale, for the presentation, which was very interesting, I think, to all of us. So as said, please, if you have any questions, please type it in the chat box that we will all see and can answer. Yes, the first question, Dale, from George. When was the assessment undertaken in Nairobi?
You're challenging me here, but I want to say 2011, maybe. So this was certainly before some of those challenges with the host government. All of this work was done, I believe, if my memory serves me right, over the 2011, 2012, with us then pulling it all together for some global guidance at the end of 2012 and into 2013. I also see your next comment there, George. I can read these as they go, so if they only pop in one at a time, this works for me. But I think the fact that the assessments marry what you did in 2012 is a good thing. I mean, I guess that means we're all on the same page, right? Finding the same things.
And I see another comment only assessed to me, Dale, from Enrique. Any highlights from the field assessment in Johannesburg?
I think what we found in Johannesburg, Johannesburg is a very unique context because you have an asylum system that's completely overwhelmed, because there is no legal way for economic migrants to come in, and because of what's been going on in Zimbabwe over the past few years, that asylum system is completely overwhelmed. So you have this mix of refugees, asylum seekers, economic migrants, and everybody struggling with the same thing. I think some of the learning in Johannesburg was that more and more refugees, they were, originally many refugees had settled in the city center, which of course is quite crime-ridden and quite a difficult environment, but that more and more they were going out to these peri-urban settlements because it was more affordable, but there were real challenges then with the infrastructure and in terms of accessing markets and services. There was some interesting work, some interesting practices, I think, among the Somalis in particular, who were doing franchising. So Somalis who had been there longer, who might have a business in downtown Johannesburg, and then opening franchises of that same business out in some of those settlements for newer Somali refugees to actually take over and work. But the majority of refugees were doing this informal market stuff, selling along the sides of the roads, etc. And again, very high risk of exploitation and abuse, especially among the females doing that.
Thanks, Dale. Jacob wishes to ask you a question on his microphone. So Jay, go ahead, please. Jacob, sorry.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dale, for a very, very relevant presentation. This is Jacob Oster from the Livelihoods unit in Geneva. It's great to see how all of this dovetails perfectly with our newly published livelihood strategy. And I just wanted to touch down on one point which I find particularly relevant, which is the notion of creating the enabling environment for refugee livelihoods in an urban setting, and particularly how it's not just about the right to work. This means a lot of things, just as you say. People often phrase it as the right to work, but it's more about labor market inclusion in general, which includes access to the services that enable the employability of refugees. So anything from access to the vocational training institution and so on and so forth that are in the country. My question is, because of such an enabling environment is required for actual livelihoods and self-reliance in the formal sector to take place, many different stakeholders, I would say, is also necessary to take into inclusion, because it's not just the right to work in a narrow sense, it's a much more broader issue. And I wanted to ask you if you've done some sort of a stakeholder mapping, trying to, in the various contexts, identify which stakeholders, which concrete stakeholders in the different settings are for or against the notion of labor market inclusion of refugees. Because there are obviously some stakeholders which will always be prone to have an antagonistic attitude towards refugees entering the labor market. That would often be labor unions, whereas you could probably see business organizations and chambers of commerce representing the business interests being more favorable towards refugees, because they see it all as equal as lowering the price of labor and increasing the labor pool. I don't know if you've tried to sort of investigate this in some of the contexts. It would be very interesting to know.
No, Jacob, I think it's a very relevant question, and it relates to a question I think Volker also posted in the chat, and that is, I think that mapping of who those stakeholders are, we certainly didn't do that. It needs to happen. Who has decision-making authority? Who do you want to influence, and how do you want to do that? So I think that's incredibly important. I also think, though, that we often haven't got our advocacy arguments kind of in line, right? We might go in asking governments for the right to work, and I'm not sure that's the starting point. I think we need to be going in talking about, again, this access to a wide range of services and why that's important and how that can also be helpful. What does that mean for how we use our resources so that we create this win-win? I remember meeting with some of the government officials in Kampala when we were there, and there, technically, the refugees have the right to work in the formal market, but at the same time, that was interpreted differently by different ministries within the government. Do they need a work permit? Do they not need a work permit? Do those informal businesses need to be registered? Do they not need to be registered? So there were inconsistent messages there. But I think one of the messages with governments has to be, the refugees are here. We don't have a solution for them yet. They're not going to go home until it's safe for them to go home. How do we keep them safe? Because they're going to find ways to actually take care of themselves, and that's going to be legal or that's going to be illegal. And if governments are worried about crime and theft and all of those kinds of things, well, let's provide legal access to some of this stuff. I mean, I think we have to get some of these arguments lined up, as well as some of the arguments and the case studies about the contributions refugees have made in urban contexts, because I think that speaks more positively and can be more impactful for some of these governments who only see refugees as competition.
Thank you, Dale. I believe there were some comments in the chat box addressed to everyone from George Folker and also from Carolyn. So maybe if you want to address those. And I also saw Laura raising their hand, so maybe she can also talk afterwards.
Okay, George, on the 37% of countries that have enacted these supportive policies, I guess I would throw it back to you all, because I don't know if there's a country where work permit issuance is working perfectly well. I certainly didn't see that. Like I mentioned in Kampala, the various ministries viewed it differently. There wasn't a consistent message coming out of government, and I have not seen it work beautifully anywhere, but those of you who are on the webinar may have seen good examples of this. Caroline, good practice in the context of a population that it aims at onward movement. Yeah, that's a tricky one, right? Many times the refugees don't want to be where they are. Many of them, even in the various cities that we studied, want to be resettled, and that actually was a disincentive for them actually building their skills and trying to earn money while they're there. So yes, I think your point about how do we focus on transferable skills, things that are going to be useful for them anywhere. And I think some of the work we've done on vocational training programs, for example, what we found is that it's not the occupational skill that actually leads to better outcomes, but it's the transferable skills, the financial literacy, business savvy, entrepreneurship skills that actually are much more important than knowing how to be a carpenter, for example. So how do we think about those transferable skills and really make those a part of the program? And then I see another message just to me from, sorry, these are moving quickly, from Ronok about the methodology for market assessments. That's a good point. I haven't seen anybody who knows how to do a really good market assessment. We've developed a market assessment toolkit. Very imperfect, needs a lot of work. I think there's a lot we still have to learn here in terms of figuring out how to do a thorough market assessment. Certainly, I think from interviewing refugees who have jobs and figuring out how they found those jobs, certainly interviewing employers of refugees to figure out why are you hiring these individuals versus host country nationals, and then even doing some targeted interviews and observations of various markets, not just the traditional markets we think about, of those who are selling goods or services, and trying to get an understanding of the level of income, the level of expense, what the turnover is, which markets are saturated, which might there be more opportunities. I think we can at least start to get a picture. It's going to be very imperfect, but that's often much better than we have now in terms of what we're trying to work with, right? So how do we at least raise the bar on on some of that contextual information in each of these environments so that we're starting in a different place in terms of tapping the skills that refugees come and figuring out where those skills might add value.
Yes, thank you. I believe there was a comment by Volker. Let me just re-put it so, Dale, you can see it in the chat box. There was Laura and Amy also with a question.
I see Laura's here. Laura's question is, have you found a lack of gender analysis across the board? I would have to say, Laura, for the most part, yes. And I think, you know, the UNHCR age, gender, and diversity approach to work has been incredibly important and helpful. But we have to recognize that that's only part of the picture, right? Because that focuses on looking at the different needs of various age and sex disaggregated groups and their proposed solutions and their capacity to contribute to those solutions. But that doesn't necessarily give us sort of the other half of the story, which is who has access to resources, how does time use vary between men and women, what are those power relationships within those households and communities between the ages and the sexes, because that also should be very important contextual information in terms of doing targeted programming then. If we're doing a program to promote women's economic empowerment and we don't know some of the constraints and some of the workloads that are already facing them or on those women, how do we then do that program? I'm sorry, there's quite a few messages here, so.
Yes, I believe there was also Amy Slaughter who only posted the question to me privately. Amy, please repost your questions and select everyone to send to. Oh, that's perfect. So, Dale, please, the question there.
There's a question from Amy. Okay, here. Amy, that's a great question. I assume everybody can see that about tools and indicators to measure refugees' progress towards self-sufficiency in an urban environment. I am not aware of similar tools in existence that partners have come up with to measure that, except in the resettlement context. But I think I would love to see that, and I would love to have that shared if you feel comfortable sharing that, and perhaps even doing a webinar in the future on that, Amy, because I think that's exactly, as we think about employing this graduation model, that's exactly the kind of thing we want to be promoting, is how do we know if they're graduating up this model? How do we know if they're graduating off of the external assistance and are in fact self-sufficient? I do think some of the resettlement agencies, for example, in the U.S., use some sort of tools to do that with the refugees being resettled here, but I think there's a lot of learning that needs to come out of this, and I would love to hear much more about that. I have not answered from Leah. I'm sorry, I'm losing these. Okay, regarding market assessment, Leah Campbell, I'm looking at yours. IRC and Oxfam are working on a market analysis guide. Is seeking best practices to include urban or refugee specific, but still relevant. Absolutely. So I guess, Leah, if I'm understanding your comment correctly, there's an opportunity for us here to contribute to that learning, because again, as has come up previously, I don't think we as a community are very good at doing market analysis, and any sort of tools or guidance that's being developed could be a real benefit for all of us, because that is, so relevant as we think about doing economic programming with refugees in urban areas. I know we're out of time, and I know I didn't answer many of the questions. I think I will turn it over to the Global Learning Center to see if we should take 5 more minutes or if I should try to get back to people offline.
Thanks, Dale. Well, I let participants decide on that. I see some more comments which are not really questions, but just comments on your session. I don't know if you want to reflect on those. We are available if you have the time, but if no more questions, then of course the discussion can go on afterwards. We close down the session, and of course there will be further communication on how this session will be made available as we recorded everything.
Yeah, and maybe I can just conclude. I mean, people, please feel free to email me directly, daleb@wrcommission.org. If I didn't get back to your comments or questions, but also to remind you that this will be available. It has been recorded. And I should also mention that there's the Urban Good Practice website, urbangoodpractices.org. So people can go there to find some of the good practices and contribute to those good practices that are being pulled together so that we can all be learning from each other. And there will be more webinars on urban refugees and how to work with and program and serve urban refugees. So any of you who have contributions to make, like Amy Slaughter and Refuge Point, it would be great to have you host similar things. But given that I know we started late, but as we're more than 5 minutes over time, I know there was also a request that I share the PowerPoint. I can do that. I can send it to Annika and Mary Beth, and then they can distribute to whoever would be interested in having it. But thank you all so much. It's really been great. Thank you for participating.
Thanks, everyone. So I guess it's time to close the session. As said, the session recording will be disseminated, so keep in touch, everyone. Thank you for being here today. Bye. Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you.